Here's a dumb one for you. Sony cameras are boring now. I just got the a7 IV. I guess it was just last week now. You know what? It's fine. I don't know what I was expecting, but I feel almost a little bit let down by it because it is so similar to the Sony a7S III. And of course, I should have known that. I've been watching videos about the a7 IV for the better part of a year now. I guess just holding the camera and comparing it to the a7S III, the body is like 95% identical to the a7S III, so it didn't exactly fill me with like the excitement of having a brand new camera that it otherwise might have if it just felt different. So maybe that's kind of what's pushing me towards making this video. I'm not really sure. But why am I saying that Sony mirrorless cameras are feeling a little bit boring, a little bit stale? Before I get into that, don't get me wrong, Sony fanboys and fangirls, I still love Sony cameras. I'm shooting on 2 Sony cameras right now. I just got the a7 IV. It's by no means a shit on Sony video. I think some of the cameras that have released, and I'm talking about like mirrorless hybrid style video cameras, not necessarily straight up video cameras or cinema style video cameras. Cameras like the Canon R5C, Panasonic GH6, most recently the Fujifilm X-H2S. All 3 of these cameras have some really interesting features that Sony just seems to not be interested in bringing to this market. And maybe for good reason, because I don't have any sales data to look at right now. My impression is that in terms of like hybrid mirrorless cameras, I think Canon is still on top, but I feel like Sony is right there in second place, pretty close or nipping at Canon's heel. My very unscientific and anecdotal impression from watching YouTube is that most people who are shooting, at least in the kind of videos that I watch, are using Sony cameras. And with good reason. I feel like at this point, Sony's cameras are just kind of workhorses, and they weren't always that way. It really kind of with the release of the a7S III, maybe the a7 III to a lesser extent. And it's not that Sony isn't releasing like new and innovative features and some stuff that other camera manufacturers haven't released or haven't done or copied, like in the a7 IV, focus breathing compensation, that focus mapping feature. Even something like the Alpha 1, I think was the first 8K camera that was like a reliable 8K camera. So what am I talking about? What haven't they done that other camera manufacturers are doing, which I find interesting? So let's take a look at the GH6 and the X-H2S. Both of those cameras allow you to shoot with the full sensor readout, something called open gate. This is helpful for a couple of different reasons. For video shooters, open gate is something that has been typically offered on high-end cinema cameras like from Arri and Red, which allow you to shoot anamorphically and not have to crop the image so much. You get much more resolution out of the sensor. So that's one reason that you would want to shoot open gate. Admittedly, a kind of a niche use case, although anamorphic lenses have gotten more and more prevalent nowadays in the budget realm, I suppose. Other reason that you might want to shoot open gate is just to shoot at 3x2 or 4x3, a much more square and taller aspect ratio than 16:9 or 17:9. If you want to do square video, maybe for Twitter, or you want to do vertical video for TikTok or Instagram, then having that taller aspect ratio allows you to more easily capture that information that you're going to just crop off the sides of. So you're not cropping off so much of the sides as you would if you just shot in 16:9 and then wanted to crop a vertical video afterward. Also gives you more information on the sides. So if you want to also capture a 16:9 video from that 3x2, then you can more easily do that as well. Whether you're cropping vertically or horizontally, shooting in the full sensor readout just gives you a lot more resolution left over. A lot of these cameras, really everything from Panasonic, from the GH5 onward, has anamorphic de-squeezing options for monitoring anamorphic lenses built into the camera. If you were to get one of those new Surui anamorphic lenses for Sony E-mounts and you try to monitor that on the back of your camera with the LCD or the viewfinder, you're going to be looking at an image that's really squished. That makes it hard to frame your shots, really kind of figure out what's in the frame and what's not and how they're going to look in the end. It also can be really hard to judge focus when everything is kind of squished together. One thing though that's really interesting about the X-H2S that could come to these cameras is, I think it's in the F-Log2 picture profile. It's actually taking 14-bit color information from the sensor and then downscaling that, is that the right term, to the 10-bit 422 final file format. Whereas I'm pretty sure that most other video cameras in this segment if you're getting 10-bit out of it, then you're probably starting from 12 bits of information rather than 14-bit. When you're shooting raw photos with these cameras, most of the time you're starting with 14 bits of color information. Something else with the GH6, which is really interesting, is that it has a dual gain output sensor. This is different from dual gain ISO, and I've mentioned this a lot of times in the past. Dual gain output is something that I think Arri pioneered, that also came to the Canon C300 Mark III and the Canon C70. And now down to the GH6. Basically like the sensors capturing highlight information and then also capturing shadow information, kind of like two different exposures, and then combining them, similar to what your iPhones are doing with all this computational photography, which helps those tiny sensors capture more data than they otherwise would be able to. It really helps with a Micro Four Thirds sensor and increases its dynamic range, and it's probably not necessarily going to compete even so with a full frame sensor, but what if you had a full frame sensor that was able to do that? That'd be pretty awesome. Also with the XH2S and the GH6 and other cameras from Panasonic even allow you to adjust picture profiles with more granularity than you can in the Sony cameras. And I'm mostly just talking about noise reduction. As someone who uses DaVinci Resolve in my post-production work, I would much rather have more control over noise reduction in post-production than rely on what's baked into the camera file. But Sony cameras don't allow you to do anything with noise reduction in the camera. Canon, like Sony, is also a very conservative company and hasn't really been enthusiastic about bringing a lot of really high-end video features to the mirrorless lineup until the R5C, and I just think it was because they caught so much flack with the R5. But what's cool about the R5C is that it has basically two operating systems. It's got the full Canon photography camera operating system on it, and then when you switch to video mode, it switches over to the EOS Cinema Line operating system. So it's almost like getting two cameras in one. And with that cinema operating system, you get all of the same kinds of features that you get on the C200, the C70, C300 Mark III, C500 Mark II, shutter angle, all of the monitoring tools for like exposure, color, and saturation. Well, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just lots and lots of video first, video-centric features. And while the Alpha 1 competes really well with the Z9 and the Canon, I don't know, what's that big mirrorless camera they came out with, the R3? Both in terms of photography and video, and they all shoot 8K. I think that the A1 only shoots 8K internally at 10-bit 420, whereas the Canon cameras, and this includes the R5C, the Nikon Z9, can all shoot in some kind of internal RAW format in 8K. And I think even 8K up to 60 frames per second. You might come back at me, and I'm sure some of you will, regardless of what I say right now. You probably won't listen this far into the video before you jump down in the comments. What about the FX3? Not only is that different in terms of how it looks in comparison to the A7S III, the A7 IV, etc., but with the newest firmware, I think it's version 2.0, they even changed a lot of the internal functionality of that camera in comparison to the A7S III. Even so, there's really nothing about the FX3 with the updated firmware that really, I don't know, does anything in regards to all the different things that I just mentioned that these other cameras are doing. I would say the only new really innovative feature, or not even innovative, but just something that kind of bumps it up towards their FX6, FX9 is just the Cine EI mode, which doesn't really do anything in terms of like image quality or image processing in comparison to, say, internal RAW video capabilities or maybe 14-bit signal getting down processed into a 10-bit 422. There's kind of a laundry list of features that other manufacturers are offering in their cameras that Sony is holding out on. It's not really like any one feature that I'm particularly clamoring for, but it's just kind of the idea that you have more options and more flexibility in how you use these other cameras than you do with Sony. I know for a lot of people, it's probably good to have kind of a simplified menu of options. I'm probably the first person who'd ever refer to the Sony menu system as simplified. But in terms of video shooting, if you look at the menu of codec and frame rate options in the XH2S and the GH6, for instance, there's way more available in those cameras than there are in Sony. For those of us who want more options, it would be nice if they were there. But maybe all these brands are just kind of throwing darts at the dartboard, hoping to find something that sticks, that will allow them to stand out and sort of capture more of the market share and compete more with Sony and Canon for that matter. And maybe Sony's just content to kind of lead the way with conservative but really highly functional cameras that just get really good results. And there's nothing wrong with that. I would just like a little bit more flexibility in how the cameras operate, some more options that are more video centric. Even stuff like, and I've harped on this in the past in a couple other videos that I made, a lot of the innovations and the new features of the A7 IV, focus mapping, focus breathing compensation, animal eye autofocus in video, and even that variable shutter, none of these features have trickle up, that's not really possible, to the A7S III or the FX3, which is pretty dumb if you ask me. You've got a $2,500 camera, which is the base line in the Alpha lineup, versus a $3,500 camera in the A7S III and a $3,900 camera in the FX3, and they still haven't gotten the features that were introduced in the A7 IV. With all that being said, I'm still happily locked into the Sony system for the foreseeable future, and I'm still very much impressed and pleased with what I'm getting from these Sony cameras, so it's not like I'm thinking about switching. I wanted to maybe just start a conversation and see how people are thinking about these Sony cameras and whether or not they are lagging behind what some of the other manufacturers are doing, and even some of the decisions regarding the firmware that I mentioned previously, the features not going up to the A7S III, the FX3, and even the FX3 switching to a more cinema-centric system and leaving behind the A7S III. It took Sony 5 years between the A7S II and the A7S III, so hopefully that release cycle will continue because I'm in no hurry to upgrade away from the Sony A7S III, but I would like to see Sony continue to support its cameras throughout their entire life cycle, and it seems like there's just this divergence between certain cameras where the FX3 gets a big new update, but the A7S III gets a piddling update. The A7 IV launches with new features that then don't see their way to the A7S III and the FX3. Anyway, that's enough rambling. Let me know what you think about what Sony is or isn't doing and what camera systems and features that you've been excited by with some of the other camera manufacturers. Thanks for watching the video, and maybe I'll see you in another one.